Hello friends. For today's video, I'm going to be chatting through my favorite books of the year that I read between the months of April and June. I'll have a separate video where I talk about my favorite new fantasy of the year because I do try to prioritize new fantasy releases as much as I can. So I'll have that go up sometime in the next couple of weeks. But if you're interested in seeing my favorites from the first quarter, both in this style where it's just favorites of the year that aren't necessarily new releases, as well as the new fantasy releases best of, I'll have that linked in the description bar down below. But I'll go ahead and get started with this chunk, this quarter's favorites. The first one would be, no surprise, Words of Radiance. I did try to make sure because I wanted to have a top 5, but I feel a little bad including Words of Radiance when in the first quarter I also said Way of Kings. But I love this series so much, and rereading it has been such a joy, and Words of Radiance was fantastic, so it was one of my favorite things that I read this quarter, and I didn't want to exclude it from the list. But I will end up having another additional 5 books besides this one to kind of make up for the fact that this is not going to be a surprise likely to anyone. But regardless, I found that I liked Words of Radiance even more on reread. Way of Kings, because I think for the first read-through of Store My Archive, always stood out as maybe my favorite in the 4 books that are currently out, and I just remembered Kaladin's story so vividly, and I remember that triumphant feeling that you get, that underdog story. It just really stuck with me. And Words of Radiance, a lot of the finer details I didn't remember as well. I, of course, remember all of the really big epic moments and the very quotable moments. I think this one is perhaps the most quotable and has the best what I call like fist bumping the air moments when you're reading. You're like, yes. I think this one maybe has the most of those. So I, of course, remembered those things. But it was all the smaller details that really stood out to me this time around. And on top of that, I think in general, getting to see the characters interact a lot more because they don't actually interact that much. But seeing them interact more in this one, it was just so fun. And when you know where things are going to go, I am able to better see all of the foreshadowing, which is true anytime you reread pretty much any book. But I feel like with Sanderson's books in particular, because he does plan so far in advance for his stories, that he lays all of those details out for you so that rereading it is such a great experience on top of just reading it for the first time. So I actually found when we dive into the Parshendi, those moments were so much more impactful to me and I cared so much more. And as I said, it's also partially that I know where things are going to go. So it's really exciting. And then there's, of course, things that I haven't seen play out just yet, but we all have our predictions about, and being able to go back through and be like, okay, now this theory I think has a lot more weight now that I see it again. And anyway, it's just been so fun rereading Store My Archive. So Words of Radiance definitely was a standout. Another one that I read rather recently, and I mentioned it in a wrap-up, was Kindred. I won't go too in-depth because I did just talk about it so recently, and a lot of you likely know this one because it's basically a classic at this point. This is a story that follows a Black woman who is living in relative modern day. It's actually, at this point, not modern because we're in 2020 and this was in like the 70s that she lived, but the idea is that she gets transported back in time to when there is still slavery in the United States. And when she first gets transported, she doesn't really know what's happening, but she sees a young boy that is drowning and she does what she can to save him. And then this boy and her are linked, so every single time that she ends up finding herself transported back in time, it's always to that young boy. His name is Rufus, but each time she goes back, Rufus has aged quite a lot, and so she is seeing the descent of this individual. She's seeing the way that he is not only corrupted by his time, but in my opinion, the way that he has had plenty of opportunities to allow positive influences to shape him, to help enlighten him, and instead of taking that route and doing the difficult thing, he just utilizes every word that is said, every action to his advantage to get what he wants, and you see the way that he can be rather manipulative and whiny and awful. He's just probably one of my least favorite individuals I've ever come across in any book. But then, of course, there's a lot of commentary on how quickly people can become desensitized to horrific acts, how when you are so brutal to another human being, when you mistreat them as the slaves that her name is Dana, the slaves that Dana interacts with, she sees the way that so many of them are just trying to get by. They're just trying to survive. They're just trying to make the best of what they have. And what they have isn't very much because of awful people like stupid Rufus. There's so much to this story that I think is very poignant and important. And I thought it was really well done. It's not an easy read. It's not an enjoyable read. It does start to feel repetitive, but I think the repetitiveness of the book is intentional because it's sort of forcing you from the comfort of your own home or wherever you're reading to imagine, like, you're getting irritated at just the fact that you're like, I mean, oh, look, another awful thing. And you're like, yeah, you just get to see it in a book, if that makes sense. So I think the repetitive nature is trying to capture that is what it's like for them every single day, every single month, every single year. It's just the same over and over and over again of mistreatment. It was very, like I said, very good, but not enjoyable. Does anybody read that and they're like, wow, that was so entertaining? I hope not. I mean, it's hard sometimes to describe books that cover such heavy topics. The next one was extremely entertaining, and it's not that it didn't have some heavier topics in it, because it did, but it is satirical, and I definitely have seen people have mixed feelings about it, but I loved it, and that would be Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This is my favorite thing by R.F. Kuang that I have picked up. I read Babel and The Poppy War. I did not finish the Poppy War trilogy, but I read the first one, Babel, and then this one, and I read them in that order, Poppy War, Babel, Yellowface. And thus far, I have found that R.F. Kuang's works, they do always have a lot of really important things that they are shedding light on, and she's using her areas of expertise in language and in history to really transport you to, sorry, I'm kind of overusing that word after talking about Kindred, but she really has you go to these time periods. And in the case of the Poppy War, it is fantasy, but it very much feels inspired by real history. And she is able to create these very vivid, real feeling places for you to experience. And I think that she does that very well, but she also puts within those times the hardships and the things that people are having to endure, and then the questions that arise as far as going up against those in power. And that's more so, I would say, something in Babel. In the Poppy War, you see a lot to do with class, war, the brutality of war. And then in Babel, it's kind of like from a distance, but the people that are kind of accidentally contributing to the ability to conquer other peoples and to wage war without really having anybody who can go against them. And so you're seeing all these really, really heavy, important things. Yellowface, I felt like she was almost like, I kind of just want to have fun. That's what it felt like, because it was so fun, but nobody's a good person. Nobody in the story is good whatsoever. So I'm sure you've heard the premise, but if you don't know, in Yellowface, we follow a woman named June, and June's friend Athena, who is very similar in a lot of ways to R.F. Kuang, which I think was intentional. But June's friend Athena is this amazing author who's reached just such enormous success so quickly, and she's so young and pretty and perfect. And then Athena dies in a really stupid way, and June's like, oh my gosh, Athena. And then she realizes that Athena had a manuscript that only she knows about. And at first she is going through the manuscript, just kind of trying to process the trauma of having seen her friend die right in front of her. She just kind of goes to the manuscript because she's a writer herself, and she starts to edit it and tweak it. And then she gets really sucked into it, and then she thinks, well, I can't let this go unread. The world deserves to see it. And then she publishes the book as her own. And then all of these questions come up as to, one, internally, did I do anything wrong? And she's like, no, I didn't do anything wrong. And she's very much constantly insisting that she's done nothing wrong. And then you get reviewers, you get other people in publishing, you get all these other people that are either really, really angry at June, they don't think this is her story to tell, not even knowing that it's literally not her story, but just because of the content of the story and who June is as a person, they're like, it's not your place to talk about this. And then you get the people in publishing, some of whom are like, I don't think that this passage should be here. I think you need sensitivity readers. And then there's other people that are like, you're amazing, June. You're our next it girl. And it just shows how everybody kind of is doing things for themselves, for their image, for money. It just from one group to the next, everybody's awful, everybody's annoying, and I thought it was super entertaining because I just feel like she had a lot of fun with it. I don't think with the other ones that I was discussing, Poppy War and Babel, in those I feel like there's much more of a look at how awful these things are. Don't we all agree that these things are awful? And there's some nuance, of course, in her other works, but I definitely think there's sort of a message within them. And in this, there's so many different things you could get from it, and people could probably have very different interpretations of various different things in that story. So I greatly enjoyed that. I kind of like just laying it all out there and then letting the reader decide for themselves how they feel about various different things. So I thought it was a blast. I had a lot of fun. Next up is one that is not fun, not even a little bit. And actually I read Yellowface and this book around the same time, and that would be Fall and Rise. This is a nonfiction book about 9/11. Every time I hold this up, it like really affects the lighting. But anyway, this is a nonfiction about 9/11, and it goes through first the flights, and then it goes to the towers themselves. And you do follow for small chunks of time various different people. It's not fictionalized. Everything is based off of phone calls that people on the flights were making to their loved ones, or just general knowledge about those people, survivors' accounts of what happened. So all of it is real, and it's very difficult to read, but I definitely think it's one of those things where it's such a horrible thing that happened that I think a lot of us don't want to look further into it, but it is helpful to know what transpired, and I think it kind of opens your eyes, makes you more empathetic. All the things that nonfiction is supposed to do, I thought it did really well. I'm only not going all that in depth with it because it's hard to talk about, because it is really brutal and really tragic, but it's definitely worth reading, and I thought it was exceptionally well done. After that, I haven't had a chance to read too much of this series, and likely when I do read more of it, I will be talking about it on one of my other channels, FMA, or Full Meta Analysis. So I'll have that channel linked, but I loved this manga, and I just needed to mention it because I feel like on BookTube at least, it's not very hyped, and it's so good, and I'm so excited to read more of it, and that would be Golden Kamuy. So this is a historical fiction manga. You follow a young man who was in battle. He was in a war, and his friend died in this war, and he has promised his friend that he will take care of his widow and his child as best as he can. And the widow has some health concerns, so the friend realizes that if he is going to really help her, he needs to obtain a lot of wealth. And he has heard stories about this gold, and this is all somewhat relatively rooted in actual history. So the whole idea of there being this gold rush and this person looking to find this gold, that part is not that out there. And so you're following this person as he is looking to find this gold. It's the how to find the gold that seems really bizarre. The map pieces, we'll say, that he is trying to find, that part's a little strange, but he ends up allying himself with an indigenous girl, and she is the best. And this book, or this manga series, I should say, I feel like I have learned so much about this culture of this indigenous group of people. And it's really interesting because it's like watching historical fiction, gold rush, action adventure mixed with National Geographic, because there's so much to do with nature and food and the environment and surviving. And it's a really interesting mix, and some of you might be like, I don't know if that sounds good or if that sounds like it's for me, but it's so good. And also, there's a wolf in it, and it looks like Luna Bear, and I love the wolf so much. I love it so much so far. So, highly recommend Golden Kamuy. It's also very funny, just kind of the clashing, or maybe the coming together of different cultures, people from different cultures, and then what that entails as far as their beliefs and how they connect to nature and animals, and then what they eat is there's a lot of, that's another thing. It's like watching a cooking channel also, because they are constantly eating. Anyway, it's very, very good. I have been loving it so much so far, so I can't wait to read more Golden Kamuy. Last, we have another one that I have talked about not that long ago, and I actually did a whole in-depth non-spoiler review for this one, and that would be The Wishing Game. This was very sweet, very delightful, very hopeful, but also touched on some pretty heavy topics. And the setup is that we follow this young woman who is kind of down on her luck. She doesn't have much in the way of a nice house or finances or transportation or anything like that, but she's getting by. However, just getting by is not really enough for her anymore because there's this young boy that she desperately wants to adopt. She knows him because she is an aide for a kindergarten class, and he came through that class, and she just feels so strongly for him. She just has this love for this young boy who has endured quite a bit in his few years of life. And so she really wants to try to go down the route of foster care through adoption to be able to have him as her son. But given her home life and her circumstances, it just doesn't seem like that's ever going to happen. And then the other notable character in the story, is this eccentric old man who is a famous children's book author. And he has not been writing for years at this point. Nobody really knows why. But he decides to write another book, and it's a huge deal. There's a media frenzy about it. Everybody's talking about it online. It's trending. And he decides that he's going to have some people come to his home and compete to win this one manuscript. And if you win this manuscript, you're pretty much set for life because publishing will pay you a lot of money to get their hands on the manuscript. And our main character is invited. She is one of the people that's invited to go to his house and compete for this manuscript. She sees this as a perfect opportunity to try and be able to get something finally, be able to have a little bit more money so maybe she can adopt that young boy. And there is a lot that is very cute and, like I said, sweet, hopeful, and kind of silly about the story. But then there's some really heavy things in it, and I think that in a short amount of time it's touched on very, very well. I do think that the beginning is one of the weaker parts of the story because it's a little bit... There's parts of it that are a little cheesy. Some of the dialogue is a little cheesy. But I think that it was definitely one of my favorite books that I've read this year. And for me, just some of the themes that are touched on, especially found family, the trauma of the trauma you experience as a child and how that extends into adulthood, all of those sorts of things, I just thought were done exceptionally well. So for me, this book really hit hard and I loved it, and I loved that it still had that hopefulness to it. So highly recommend The Wishing Game. Let me know what your favorite books of the year have been so far. I will have, as I said at the beginning, my favorites of the year from the first quarter, as well as my favorite new fantasy of the first quarter linked down below. And if you're interested in any of these or hearing any in-depth thoughts, I'll have any reviews or anything like that linked in the description bar, as well as purchase links in case you're interested in checking them out for yourself. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.